Okay, so this is our final lecture of the semester, and I just wanted to come on and do a video lecture rather than just do a presentation on PowerPoint, because I thought it might be nice to go through all of these sources of information that I've been looking at, also to prepare you all for the reading of the chapter this week on Afrique Noire. It is a challenging chapter. And so my hope in doing a video lecture and a discussion of the topic would be that it would prepare you to better understand some of the concepts presented, because in my opinion, this particular chapter is written more like a graduate level textbook. So it is, there are a lot of high concepts within the chapter. Beautifully written, wonderful information, very intriguing to think about the ideas of developmental science given a different philosophy and way of looking at life, and that's what we see in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted to have a little bit of discussion about that. The portion in the chapter on demographics is dated, obviously. The issues related to HIV and AIDS are still very much present and still very much current, in that is still a pressing issue in Sub-Saharan Africa. But I do want to update some of the demographic information to reflect some of the current things that have been happening in Africa, particularly with COVID, and some other things related more to digital technology that I think you'll find interesting, related to the provision of services in Africa as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start in my discussion of the chapter on Afrique Noire, or Sub-Saharan Africa, by saying that the textbook points out several different issues related to the study of developmental science and child development and families in Africa, and those really focus, these issues really need to be focused within the framework, the psychological framework, or the developmental framework that exists within Sub-Saharan Africa. Within the module this week, you'll note that I have posted a map of Sub-Saharan Africa, which is considered distinct from Northern Africa and the Middle East. You'll notice on the map that the regions of Africa are divided up between West and Central and East. I believe actually it's just West and East, but you can see that there's sort of Central Africa as well, with the Democratic People's Republic of Congo sort of in the center of the Sub-Saharan Africa there. The textbook points out that there are, 48 nation states in Sub-Saharan Africa, so there is quite a wide diversity, not just in the topography or the geography of the places, the concerns, the languages, religions, so therefore many different cultural influences as well. One thing that we do have to note when we're thinking about Africa is the effects of in slavery, the slave trade had on the continent of Africa. That European slave trade really impacted not just the people for that period of time, but it has created a lasting legacy that has affected the country still. And our economic practices as a world and a global economy have also affected Africa, because Africa is a very rich culture, a very rich country, and so there are plenty of resources, and people being a tremendous resource, as we've discussed throughout the course. Human beings are human resources, so there are a lot of resources within Africa. However, we have to acknowledge that colonialism, European colonialism, and the slave trade have impacted Africa significantly and have created these lasting effects that Africa still experiences today. About that, just like in Europe, there were cultural, conflicts between nations, between tribal groups. Indigenous people experience conflict just as they have throughout the world. However, with the European slave trade, it did introduce some new factors into the country. One of those things was guns and ammunition. So having guns now within portions of Africa, particularly West Africa, for example, now you had conflicts that were taking place between tribal groups, and those groups that had determined to enter into relationships with European slavers then also were permitted to receive new resources, and again, one of those was guns. So tribal groups that decided not to participate in the slave trade due to their own feeling about what that was doing to their society were then placed at a disadvantage related to their neighboring tribes, who were then also receiving guns and other other resources as a result of participation in the slave trade. So as you can imagine, this affected tribes, not just these tribal groups, not just in taking people away and the human factor in that, just the loss, the grief, taking men away, because primarily men were being sold into slavery, but then also having people who determined not to participate in that morally reprehensible behavior were now at a disadvantage related to their neighbors who they may have been in conflict with, who were participating and benefiting from that. So again, an increase in violence, an increase in hostilities between people groups, just the psychological toll that it took on people who had members of their families, members of their villages taken from them. It was devastating. So with that, I think it's helpful to understand when we think about developmental science and psychology within the country of Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, we have to also think about the fact that anything that's associated with European colonialism would also be seen with some level of, rightfully so, suspicion. And so places that were colonized, particularly you'll find out in the text, but places that were colonized by Spain or by Portugal, some of those countries have been reluctant to embrace psychology. Other countries, like as the book points out, South Africa has embraced psychology for whatever reason, and Uganda has played a part in attachment theory. There have been studies within Uganda that help to expand the ideas found within attachment theory. So Africa has a unique place within developmental science and within family science because again, the developmental framework is so different, and also because there has been this hesitancy to embrace some of these ideas about psychology that were developed within the European continent. And so again, so much of what we understand about culture is related to history, and we see that again in Africa as well. So that's not to say that there isn't understanding about developmental frameworks within Africa. The things that we need to pay close attention to are how Africa is centralized around this idea of a theistic society. So being aware that one of the commonalities across Sub-Saharan Africa is that there is this emphasis on God being the center of life and development. So that's an important an important point to remember about developmental science in Africa, is that it's really based on this idea of God being the center. Again, with the different countries, it doesn't mean that necessarily everyone has the same belief in the same God. You can go to the CIA fact book, which I'll put, or I've got links. I will put links in the comment section or the description section of this video, so that you can go and look up some of the information that I'll be talking about in the video lecture today. So be sure and check out some of those things, especially if these are topics that are interesting to you. Again, theism, it's a theistic society or culture. It is also a culture, Sub-Saharan Africa is also focused on family, extended family. So family looks slightly different in Sub-Saharan Africa than it does in the United States. When we think about extended families here in the United States, I've had the privilege of working with families who may have the mom, the dad, children, and maybe grandparents, within that household. And I've even worked with families who, they even have aunts and uncles within the family. Well, within Sub-Saharan Africa, that would be more common. The nuclear family of a mom and a dad and children is really foreign and strange to Sub-Saharan Africa in general. So you have to think about how protective this is of families, because elder people within the family, friends within the family, children, extended partners to the primary married couple are also embraced within this particular extended type of a family. And it is really crucial with AIDS and the HIV epidemic. It did decimate somewhat this idea, because so many parents were lost to AIDS. So many families have had to sort of adapt to that. And I had a friend, he died a few years ago, or 2 years ago, who was a pastor in Kenya, and he and his wife had taken in, at one point it was close to 30 orphans. In Kenya, there was quite a challenge with regard to the number of children who had been orphaned due to the AIDS epidemic. And my friend Peter he and his wife had taken in orphans so that they would be well cared for. As the text points out, many families sprung up that were led by children, however. So siblings were accustomed to taking care of younger children within the family. And so when parents were lost to AIDS, then these children would take care of themselves. Another idea to think about is that here in the United States, we tend to think of siblings taking care of other siblings, their younger siblings, as sort of they're standing in for mom. Mom is going to go off and do something for a little bit, and the children are in charge just until she gets back. But within Africa, this idea of extended family really is slightly different. There's a slight difference to that view. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, it would be more viewed that mom is sort of the manager of the family, rather than the kids are kind of in charge until she gets back. It's that she's managing the care of the children, and so she's putting the siblings in charge of the younger siblings, or there are other people that are standing in. So it's not all falling to mom to care for the children. It's an interconnected system in which all of the family members routinely care for one another. And children are born into this environment that's interconnected again. And so their identity within this interconnected group is really formed. And so again, kind of this difference of an idea that we have developmental frameworks for thinking about children developing in the context of society, but within Sub-Saharan Africa, again in general, It's this idea that children are really born for their place in society, that everyone is connected, that there is individuality, there is identity that people have, but it really is developing within the context of the people and that they're around, their family. And again, this broad definition of family that exists within one household, and also within their peer groups, that they are engaged in ongoing learning that's taking place, that they're taking from their environment and learning what they need to know in order to be a part of their culture, be a part of their society, and that intelligence that they are displaying is really a basis for service and being a part of things. And so here we might look at a very intelligent child, a gifted child, and say, oh, well, they're smart, and therefore they can succeed very well on their own. We don't necessarily always have an idea about that intelligence being important to society. We kind of do talk about that and say, well, that person's really smart. Maybe they'll have a company that will be really good for the economy or whatever. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's this slightly different view of children being really crucial to their environment because they can serve one another, and to be part of solving problems, which we're going to talk about just a little bit when we talk about the state of things currently, especially post-COVID. The other thing that you'll see within the textbook is this discussion of pronatalist views. The idea that within Africa it is a terrible thing to be infertile, to not have children, for a couple to not have children is a hated thing, is something that they would absolutely not want to have happen to them, because it is the dream of each person within Sub-Saharan African society, generally speaking, again, to have children, to have many children. And so there's a tension within Sub-Saharan Africa for parents who really desire to have children. Again, the cultural idea of pronatalism, pro-reproduction. There's this idea that within the culture, of course, having children is a desired thing and a blessing to the families. But then there's also the reality of economics and how difficult it may be for a family to have children and to be able to support those children. So there's that tension between reproduction and being productive, having children, and being thoughtful about how many children to have. So this tension will be continuing to be seen. Birth rates continue to be very high in Sub-Saharan Africa due to the pronatalist aspect of this culture. But again, that isn't to deny the economic realities of Africa and the healthcare realities of Africa. Mothers are certainly viewed very positively in Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, going with this pronatalist idea of children being born and being a part of society, and this being a beloved thing and a desired thing. Mothers are treated very well, generally speaking, and are really meant to be free of stress so that the baby is not stressed when the baby is developing. So again, kind of a way similar to what we learned about in India with regard to the care for mothers and the care that they receive post birth and delivery and all of that. So again, interesting things when we think about how culture views family, how culture views children, and the ways that affects outcomes. Okay, so with all of that, I'm going to turn to some information about demographics and about the post-COVID world in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are a great many concerns, and again, as I've done in the past, I like to pose these ideas as, we have the strengths and then we have the challenges that then create opportunities. And so I want to talk a little bit about those opportunities as well. And again, not to discount some of the significant challenges that there are in Sub-Saharan Africa, but to remember that when we're thinking of people, that we always want to think about the resources and the resilience that people are capable of, and the fact that people have their own determination to do well within their environment. And so we want to acknowledge that, rather than we have to always have this sort of paternalistic idea that comes out of colonialism, this idea that someone has to go in and take care of things for someone else. We can certainly help. There's nothing wrong with helping, but there is something wrong with viewing people as lacking in resources. Now, the source for this portion of the lecture is really coming from the UNICEF Sub-Saharan Africa Child Alert. And again, I'm going to post the link in the video description. It is a lengthy report. It's about 28 pages. But I wanted to hit some highlights, and some of these things you're going to see on the exam. So I want you to pay careful attention and, again, go through the study guide as you're listening to the lecture if possible. So recent reports, this report that I'm speaking of was just published in 2021, so a great deal of this information is concerned with the COVID outbreak and how that impacted Sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that that was noted in the report was that just as supply chains were disruptive across the United States and Europe due to the pandemic, that has been true as well for Sub-Saharan Africa. So vaccines have been disrupted, the supply of vaccines have been disrupted, and it has disrupted healthcare generally speaking. So I'm going to kind of briefly go through some of the challenges that are faced, things that were already being faced in Sub-Saharan Africa that are exacerbated by the COVID epidemic. In Kenya, a third of all crimes reported in the first month after the COVID-19 outbreak were related to sexual violence. So that's a pretty significant amount of trauma that has been inflicted upon children there in Kenya, for example. Throughout the report, we continue to see that when children are taken away from school, when schools shut down, safety is also taken away as well. So due to stress, due to cultural issues, many children are experiencing violence and stress due to domestic violence within the homes, and also due to particular kinds of violence that children are subjected to just due to gender-based violence. There is a lot less protection that's afforded to children when they're not in school. There's also a lot less opportunity for children to receive the nutrition that they need when they're not in school, because so often schools in Sub-Saharan Africa, just like in the United States, are providing food for children throughout the day. One of the things that I often say with regard to shutting down a school, like for an ice day or like for COVID, things like that, is there are vulnerabilities for certain members of the population, especially, here in the United States, just like in Sub-Saharan Africa. And when we don't have children in school, it increases exacerbates those vulnerabilities for those children. Again, not getting food, not getting the opportunity to be educated, and for parents who are extremely stressed out or who can't afford to feed their children, they oftentimes take that out on children. So again, this was already a problem in Sub-Saharan Africa. It has just been exacerbated. So in West and Central Africa, an important thing for you to know is that this region contains the second highest number of children with HIV in the world. Because COVID testing was prioritized in Central and West Africa, it meant that HIV testing was delayed, which meant that for those children who also had HIV, potentially, that if they had HIV and it wasn't found, they didn't test for that, then that meant that treatment was also delayed, which again increases mortality rates, increases poor health, and with sexual violence increasing in certain areas can also increase the spread of HIV and AIDS. So again, another issue that is exacerbated by COVID. Now, on the other side of that, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal they were able to strengthen HIV programs within communities by finding people who were already engaged in the work of HIV treatment or getting HIV medications out. They found some of those individuals within their communities and strengthened those individuals so that they could then get HIV treatment out or continue to get those HIV treatments out to families within those regions. In this way, it prevented disruption of HIV treatment because, as we know, without the retroviral drugs for HIV quickly increases to AIDS, which is deadly. So, again, those countries were able to find a way to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on HIV treatment. Already, there was a strained healthcare system in Sub-Saharan Africa. COVID did increase those strains and make things a lot harder and a lot worse. Because people in Africa were reluctant to receive care or to go to care places because of the fear of getting COVID-19, it meant that there was a disruption in prenatal care, immunizations, and well-child checkups. So already what was a difficult situation was made far worse because of those issues. And you should also know that millions of children currently are unable to receive vaccinations or their well-child immunizations in West and Central Africa, again, due to those disruptions in the supply chain. So that region already is suffering from the lowest childhood vaccination rates in the world. So that was already a bad situation. Now it's far worse. Misinformation was another reason for vaccine hesitancy in Africa, but countries like Benin have countered that with a rollout of vaccinations within communities that enabled children to get vaccinated, adults to get vaccinated, and also at the same time countered that misinformation that was circulating out in the community. And so that's been another opportunity. One problem that has been faced within Sub-Saharan Africa is hand washing and just washing stations. And so that is an area that we tend to sort of take for granted, that we can use the restroom and wash our hands or wash our hands as a regular basis. We knew that hand washing we've known for centuries actually, that hand washing defeats or prevents the spread of communicable illnesses, which we learned in chapter 3 is the number one cause of the spread or the mortality in children under 5, right? So when you think about this, not just from the spread of COVID, but the spread of a lot of diseases, if children are not able to wash their hands and just be clean, just keep their hands clean, then they're spreading bacteria and viruses and just all of that from just being outside and playing or going to the bathroom and then eating. So UNICEF has been leading the charge to improve hand washing stations by making sure that those are available throughout Sub-Saharan Africa in those areas where this is a problem. Malnutrition continues to be a problem throughout Africa. Breastfeeding is a good way to prevent malnutrition. And it's, this isn't just a bad thing, it's a grave risk to children, that more children are dying due to malnutrition in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, there are campaigns to encourage mothers to breastfeed. And we know that when mothers breastfeed from birth, it prevents 20% of newborn deaths. 20% of newborn deaths when they breastfeed from birth. And then exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months prevents 13% of under 5 deaths. That's pretty significant information. And so one thing that again, COVID exacerbated this topic is because mothers were afraid that when they got COVID, that they might spread it to their newborns or to their infants. And so they would stop breastfeeding. Well, again, when we know that the ramifications of not breastfeeding are so severe and so significant for this very vulnerable group of children, there had to be this misinformation countered to tell mothers, please continue to breastfeed, explaining how important it is to the babies. So again, another thing, you will see this on the test, is that malnutrition is the single largest killer of children under 5 in West and Central Africa. Again, single largest killer, malnutrition in West and Central Africa. So severe issues, and again, COVID exacerbated that. Worldwide, 160 million children live in high drought severity zones, and 500 million children live in extremely high flood occurrence zones. So as we think about children in Sub-Saharan Africa who are also in drought zones and high flood occurring zones, this is millions of children who are vulnerable to death and just basic difficulties and being displaced due to weather-related issues. And then air pollution contributes to the deaths of close to 600 million children under 5 each year around the world. And that represents the second leading cause of death around the world for children under 5 each year. So Sub-Saharan Africa is also, at risk as well with regard to pollution. So I want to share with you some of the innovations that have taken place with regard to young people in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is pretty interesting to see when we think about how kids can be a part of the future in helping solve problems. One of the things that young people have done is organized a hack for youth, UNICEF supported, and it's a way of helping young people to create these digital youth engagement programs and sort of innovating solutions. And so one of the problems that was consistently found in Sub-Saharan Africa was access to education. So young people there have created innovations so that they can have they can continue to receive education even using cellular devices. So there's been that, and television stations have been able to consistently deliver education information, so kids could continue to receive educational instruction through television stations, radio stations, also digital platforms. Some of the more remote areas that are difficult to get to have been reached through drones, which is interesting when we think about that. That's kind of neat to think about the idea of women and children receiving care from drones. Pause. Okay, so I had to pause because for whatever reason my printer that's sitting right here next to my computer decided to clean itself. So, okay, I think my computer printer is finished cleaning. Sorry about that noise. At any rate, so there are a number of things that have been done to sort of support people within within Sub-Saharan Africa. Schools have been reopened, and there have been more programs to have hand washing stations within schools. So as schools have reopened, as all these different innovations for digital technology have happened, things are improving. And so again, this was our most recent information from 2021. It'll be interesting to see, when more information comes out in 2023, and subsequently on and on, how some of the COVID-19 disruptions have been, fixed or have, been mitigated. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is within Africa, across Africa, there have been digital ID programs, digital identity documents. And so one reason that this is a significant thing is because, like, for example, in Kenya, the Kenyan government decided several years ago to make education free. And the way that they decided to implement this is through digital ID cards. And these are being used across the continent of Africa. The catch is that families need to also provide a birth certificate for their children in order to get a digital ID card. So in Kenya, for example, there was a run on government centers to try to get birth certificates for their children, and there's been some challenges to getting those ID cards up and going. So in the initial phase of this, they're biometric cards that have to do with like fingerprints and things like that. So the initial phase of that, families were struggling to get their cards. The government would issue the card, and then they didn't have a way to get them back to the families. And so there's been new technology to create the cards immediately as soon as the family comes in to apply for them. So there's some concern about the use of digital ID cards, what is going to happen with that information. So this is kind of one of those things to watch. However, it is going to make it a lot easier to keep track of children and to keep track of families who have these digital ID cards associated with them. For example, I will tell you that when you look at the CIA fact book for Somalia, it is primarily a rural, nomadic society in many places, and so some of the demographic information on the people of Somalia is very lacking due to a lot of things, not just the AIDS crisis or the nomadic nature of the people, but also the fact that there has been a great deal of conflict. And so the Somali government has information from the 70s on how many people are in the country, and that's kind of what our government has used to sort of extrapolate how many people we think are there. But with things like digital ID cards, it would be easier to kind of know what's going on with people in the world. Again, this idea though of colonization and colonialism affecting the history of the people of Sub-Saharan Africa means that there's also going to be some of that hesitancy to become registered with the government. So again, something to watch, this idea of datafying a people group and trying to unify in some ways and improve the outcomes for people is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So with that, I'm going to end, and again, I'll post links in the video description for you to follow up on some of these topics. It has been a pleasure to be your professor this semester, and I hope that you have gained as much from this course as I have gained from teaching this course. And I look forward to hearing more from you all, and hope that you'll keep in touch.